the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Friday, March 20th, 2015. The sugar industry is up in arms over a proposed FDA plan to label added sugars on processed foods. We'll speak with Professor Michael Goran, a diabetes and obesity researcher, about it. And President Obama just floated the idea of mandatory voting as Oregon adopted a sweeping motor voter law. We'll turn to the Brennan Center's Jonathan Braten to discuss how more voters can participate in democracy. Plus, this week is Sunshine Week. Trevor Timm of the Freedom of the Press Foundation will join us to discuss why the Freedom of Information Act is in danger. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Cristina Mislan. She's an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Cristina.
Hello, Sonali.
Scientists at the University of Colorado this week have found the lowest sea ice levels in the Arctic ever recorded. Arctic sea ice is a strong indicator of the impacts of climate change, and the news comes in the same week that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration found that the months December 2014 to February 2015 were the warmest global temperatures on record for that time of the year. Meanwhile, the Guardian newspaper has just found that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has $1.4 billion worth of investments in fossil fuel companies. Reporters analyzed the foundation's latest available tax filing and found investments in dozens of companies, including ExxonMobil, BP, Chevron, Royal Dutch Shell, and others. And the findings are all the more surprising given the Gates Foundation's stated concern about climate change. The Guardian has partnered with 350.org in a petition calling on the Gateses to divest from the companies. Cristina, are you surprised by the double standards of these altruistic but obscenely rich people?
Yeah, I can't say that I'm surprised. I think, especially with the conversation about climate change, and we could probably say the same about other issues as well, is that climate change, because it's been so politicized in mainstream discourse and in mainstream conversations, we're often telling people, individuals what not to do, how to reduce their footprints. And so we separate the political from the economy. And I think what the Gates are doing is a reflection of that, of a kind of disconnect between how politics intersects with economic interest. And so I think this conversation may be about divestment, about what people should not do. For instance, how we align our values with our investment might actually be helpful for the Gates to consider here. I think that's really important to understand that politics and economic interest, and yes, investment and financial investment all intertwine, and we need to understand the relationship.
And thousands of farm workers are still on strike in San Quintin, Mexico, protesting poor working conditions. The LA Times has reported that farm workers began the strike earlier this week, blocking access to a major highway, resulting in at least 200 arrests. The workers are paid less than $10 a day to pick fruits, primarily for U.S. markets. Among the employers being targeted is the U.S.-based company Berrymex, which sells organic and conventional strawberries and raspberries through stores like Trader Joe's under the Driscoll label. The farmers at the center of the strike produce millions of tons of produce for U.S. markets. The workers, many of whom hail from indigenous communities in southern Mexico, are demanding better wages, government benefits, and overtime pay. Cristina, how important is this action, and why aren't we hearing more about it in the news outside of the LA Times?
Well, it's definitely really important. And look, this is not a new issue in terms of thinking about the exploitative labor politics that are often led by U.S. multinational companies. This is very much an old issue. And so it's super important first to understand that what we buy in the United States is often directly connected to the labor politics of other countries, right? And the exploitative labor conditions that actually exist. And the media, of course, if we did cover it, we would have to actually confront this issue and confront this contradiction, or I don't know if it's a contradiction necessarily, but we would definitely have to confront the issues of U.S. multinational companies and what we buy at the local level.
And finally, a United Nations panel just heard testimony from a group of lawyers and academics at Syracuse University called the Cold Case Justice Initiative about unsolved murders of black men and women during the era of Jim Crow segregation and the civil rights movement. There were more than 300 murders known to be mostly committed by the Ku Klux Klan that were never properly investigated by the U.S. Justice Department. Some of the perpetrators may still be alive today. The FBI has been empowered to investigate these crimes through the 2008 Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act, but apparently it has failed to properly pursue them. Meanwhile, news has emerged of what could be a new lynching. A 54-year-old African-American man named Otis Bird was found hanging in the woods in a rural part of Mississippi this week. He had been missing for several weeks. Bird's death is still being investigated. Christina, how important is it for the U.S. to obtain justice for murders that were committed 50 or more years ago?
Well, I do think it's really important that these cases are definitely investigated and that we find out what the details are and the perpetrators should be, to whatever extent they can be punished. But, I think what's even more important is that we connect this history to the hundreds of murders that have happened just in this past year, often by the hands of police. And so we need to do that connection, because if we don't, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the history, but we're not going to talk about how this is not just the past. This is actually still going on today in 2015. And so if we don't do that, then we're not really doing anyone any justice.
That's a great point. I want to thank you so much for joining us today, Cristina.
Thank you.
Cristina Mislan is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. And I'm sad to announce the passing yesterday of well-known activist, writer, and filmmaker Danny Schechter. Schechter died at the age of 72 of pancreatic cancer. He was well known for his work with anti-apartheid activists, including Nelson Mandela himself. Danny Schechter, the news dissector, as he liked to call himself, will be deeply missed. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. The food industry is up in arms over a move by the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, to label added sugars on packaged items. The proposal is a modest one, which would simply list how many teaspoons of extra sugar the food contains. Among those howling against the measure is the cranberry juice industry, which contends that cranberries are so bitter that companies are forced to add a lot of sugar to make them palatable. Currently, nutrition labels must list how many grams of total sugar are in a product, those naturally occurring and those that are added. Ingredient lists also reveal how much sugar has been added, but companies in recent years have used obscure-sounding substitutes, such as high fructose corn syrup, concentrated fruit juice, and dextrose. The sugar industry has also made major news recently when historical documents from the 1960s and 70s were discovered, revealing the close collusion between sugar manufacturers and the National Institutes of Health. The documents reveal how the sugar lobby pushed for dentists to recommend alternative preventative measures against tooth decay rather than the obvious one of controlling sugar in the diet. The so-called sugar papers are being likened to the tobacco papers. My guest is Dr. Michael Goran. He is a professor of preventative medicine, physiology, and biophysics and pediatrics, the Dr. Robert C. and Veronica Atkins Endowed Chair in Childhood Obesity and Diabetes, co-director of the USC Diabetes and Obesity Research Center, and director of the Childhood Obesity Research Center at the Keck School of Medicine at the University of Southern California. He's also the co-editor of the book Dietary Sugars and Health. Welcome to Uprising, Dr. Michael Goran.
Thank you. Good morning.
Now, on the issue of the sugar papers, the researchers who discovered the sugar industry's role in influencing dental advice found that, quote, the sugar industry funded research in collaboration with allied food industries on enzymes to break up dental plaque and a vaccine against tooth decay. So they were looking for anything but advising eating less sugar. How do you respond to the sugar papers? Were you surprised to learn this?
Yes. Yeah. On the one hand, yes. On the other hand, no. I think there's a history of other similar situations where the sugar industry or the food industry in general has tried to alter government strategies on food policy. It's not the first time.
Right. And of course, dentists know that eating sugar impacts your teeth, but sugar doesn't just impact our teeth, it impacts our entire bodies. Let's turn to the issue of the labeling. Andrew Briscoe of the Sugar Association doesn't want added sugars to be labeled on packaged foods because, according to him, quote, the lack of science to justify added sugar labeling sets an alarming precedent. Is there really a lack of science? Michael? Can you hear me, Michael? Okay, we're going to try to call Michael Goran right back. We just lost his audio, and we're talking about the sugar papers as well as a new proposal by the Food and Drug Administration to label added sugars on packaged foods. Currently, there is labeling, of course, but it's in small lettering on the back, and it doesn't necessarily reveal always what sugars are added. Michael Goran, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. So Andrew Briscoe says that there's a surprising, that there's a lack of science to justify added sugar labeling. Is there indeed a lack of science?
No, I wouldn't think so. There's plenty of evidence. I mean, certainly it's debatable like any science, but there is several lines of strong evidence linking added sugars to cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and obesity. In fact, the one clear bias that exists is that studies that are funded or associated with the food and beverage industry tend to not find an association, whereas studies not funded do find an association.
And let's explicitly just come out and say it, the problems with sugar in our diet, how do you link those to when you talk to lay people about the effects that sugar have, particularly on children, since I know that's part of your specialty? What effects do they have on the bodies of human beings enough to justify looking at sugar in the diet as a public health concern?
Well, yes. I mean, I think there's multiple reasons to be concerned. So the straight obvious one is related to the excess calories provided by sugary beverages in the absence of additional nutrients. That alone contributes to additional calories. And then, aside from the effect of the additional calories, we know that the way sugar is metabolized in the body, that it can lead to detrimental effects, independent of the effects on obesity. For example, fructose, for example, which is the main component of sucrose and is much higher in high fructose corn syrup and in fruit juices. Fructose has separate and unique effects on the body because of the special way in which it is metabolized and causes many disruptions that lead to chronic disease risk.
And you mentioned fruit juice. This is really interesting because, of course, people today consider juices as very healthy. There was a one of my coworkers just yesterday bought a juice bottle of vegetables and fruits called Green Machine by the company Naked, which boasted no added sugars. You know, they say no added sugars right on the front, and it shows this lovely photo of green veggies and fruits. But when I read the nutrition list, I saw 53 grams of sugar in this 15-ounce bottle of juice. That's almost double what's in a can of Coke. The top 4 ingredients by weight were apple juice, mango puree, pineapple juice, and banana puree, and the last ingredient was kale. What do you tell people who drink these green juices?
Well, this is going to be a very contentious issue when people start to realize that these juices contain so much sugar, as you point out. My advice is to try and eat fruit rather than drink it, and the same for vegetables. So that also, we don't really know whether or not the juicing with the added sugars, whether there's any other components in the juices like fibers left over or other micronutrients that may offset some of the effects of the sugars. That's an unknown. But I think it's a very difficult issue because of the mixed effect of juice. Vegetables sounds like it's healthy, but in fact, it's loaded with sugars that are not added sugars; they're just the natural sugars. So makes it very complicated to explain to the public.
Well, I mentioned a can of Coke, which actually by itself has about at least 8 teaspoons, little over 8 teaspoons of sugar. And there was another sugar-related controversy recently when it was discovered that Coca-Cola was found to be paying health writers and bloggers and dietitians to suggest cans of mini Coke as a, quote, healthy snack. They were writing these suggestions as part of pieces for American Heart Month, of all things. How do you respond to that? I mean, a can of Coke has 8 1/4 teaspoons of sugar, but the mini can of Coke has 5 teaspoons of sugar, which is still a lot.
Yes, and can add up pretty quickly.
A healthy snack? I mean, would you ever call it a healthy snack?
No. I think the tactics used by the beverage industry and the beverage alliance groups are very, what's the word? Are very concerning.
Deceptive, unconscionable, unethical.
Deceptive, yes.
I'll come up with a bunch of words.
Yes, I'll let you say it.
And it's interesting because there have been a lot of efforts to alert the public to the sugar problems and the amounts of sugar in our food. In California, there was a bill that would have added a warning label to sodas, heavily lobbied against by the industry, and it failed in New York. The city was trying to ban supersized sodas. That was struck down by a court. And now, of course, the FDA, as I mentioned, is trying to label added sugars. Do you support these sorts of efforts? Is this as a public health issue that could begin to address the epidemics of diabetes and obesity in this country?
Yeah, I support the California labeling strategy, which that bill, by the way, has been reintroduced and will be up again for discussion this year. I support that because it's very benign and it doesn't cost anybody anything. I mean, I also support the soda taxes, but there's good arguments against that because of the economic impact. The labeling doesn't cost anybody anything, and it's just a warning label that says consumption of excess added sugars may contribute to dental disease, obesity, and diabetes. And I don't think it's hard to argue with that statement based on the current science. And it's just simply a warning label to warn consumers who can then make their own decision as to whether they want to make that consumption or not.
Now, many people who do try to avoid sugar and high fructose corn syrup, which has gotten a bad rap in the past few years, they opt for these so-called natural sugars. There's a move among health food companies to list natural cane sugar and natural cane juice, and tout it as something healthy. For example, the Hanson's brand soda sold at health food stores say we use cane sugar in our cane sugar sodas rather than high fructose corn syrup, and they boast that made with real cane sugar. But people are also opting for honey sweetened foods, and there's new fads like coconut sugar and agave nectar. Is there any difference between any of these, or are they all just sugar in disguise and should be avoided?
Well, on the one hand, yes, sugar is sugar, and there's not much difference between the different sugars, but there is a little bit of a hierarchy in that natural cane sugar, which is sucrose, does not have as much fructose as high fructose corn syrup. And the more fructose, the more the risk and the more the potential damage on the body's systems. So there is a slight benefit. So if you if you tied me down and had me consume either natural cane sugar soda or a high fructose corn syrup soda, and I had to make the choice, I would choose the worst of the two evils. But it still comes down to, at the end of the day, that we, as a society, are consuming too much added sugars in general, and these contribute to the rising epidemics of chronic diseases.
Now, many people have been aware of the ill effects of sugar and have switched to diet drinks, which use artificial sweeteners. But there was just a report out a few days ago at the University of Texas Health Science Center that found that people over age 65 who drink diet soda daily tend to expand their waistlines by much more than those who prefer other beverages. So basically, those who drank diet sodas actually gained weight. Now, of course, I understand this is an observational study, not a controlled experiment, so you can't say there's necessarily causation. But as far as you know, can switching to diet drinks actually make you fat?
Well, the data is pretty mixed. There's also studies on the other side of the coin that show that they can help you lose or maintain weight over time. That was a recent study from last year. But worse is that we don't really know what the long-term chronic effects of these alternative sugars are on the body. During growth and development, for example. So I think we have a lot to learn about the effects of these compounds in the body, and there's emerging data that shows that some of these compounds can contribute to metabolic abnormalities.
Finally, we had recently discussed the effects of grains in our bodies. Grains like wheat and rice. Aren't grains also converted to sugars in our body? They're broken down into glucose pretty rapidly. Should we also be treating grains in a similar vein as we treat sugars?
Well, on the one hand, yes. I mean, it's quite correct that starch is broken down rapidly in the body to release glucose, which is absorbed. But there's a slight difference in that there is some kind of inbuilt regulation because of the way it's released over time. So ultimately, it depends on how much you consume. And the problem with sugary beverages is that you can consume a lot very rapidly, and it doesn't need to be metabolized. It just gets absorbed very quickly into the body where it has its effects. So it's about the dose over time and the rate of delivery into the body.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Dr. Michael Goran, for joining us today and helping shed some light on these issues.
Thank you for asking me to join you today.
Dr. Michael Goran is a professor of preventive medicine and physiology and biophysics and pediatrics, and the Dr. Robert C. and Veronica Atkins Endowed Chair in Childhood Obesity and Diabetes at the University of Southern California. This is Uprising. We'll be right back after the short break. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali. Did you know that Uprising is now a TV show as well as a radio show? We rely on subscribers to our YouTube channel to fund the TV production of Uprising, and you can sign up to be a subscriber at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Oregon this week became the first state in the nation to automatically register voters at their local DMV offices. The so-called motor voter policy means that people who apply for a driver's license will automatically be registered to vote unless they specifically opt out. Under the National Voter Registration Act signed by President Clinton in 1993, states are already required to offer voter registration forms at DMVs. And yesterday, President Obama made waves nationally when he floated the idea of mandatory voting at a speaking event in Cleveland. He pointed to countries like Australia, where voting is mandatory, and said it could have a potentially transformative effect here in the U.S. My guest is Jonathan Braten. He is the counselor in the Brennan Center's Democracy Program. Welcome to Uprising.
Thanks for having me.
How important is Oregon's new policy? Before we get to what the president said yesterday, let's focus on this one state. Why is it such a big step from what was already happening, which is offering people the chance to register to vote at DMVs as part of the law that Clinton signed?
It's very important. As you said, people already have the ability to register to vote at the DMV under the federal motor voter law. And some states have made this work better by moving to electronic registration at DMVs and sometimes in other agencies as well. That helps because electronic registration, which means transferring the registration in an electronic format instead of in an old-fashioned paper form, can help get more people on the rolls. Oregon is taking it one step further by saying that if the government already knows that you're eligible and that you have a record in the DMV, they're just going to go ahead and register you to vote. You don't have to take any additional steps in order to get on the rolls. You do have the option to opt out if you don't want to be registered, but by just taking the information they already have for people they know are eligible, they're estimating that they're going to initially add more than 300,000 eligible people to the rolls initially, and then even more in subsequent elections.
I can just imagine Republican opposition to this saying that it's a hallmark of a socialist totalitarian government that registers people against their will, and people need to have choice when it comes to whether to register to vote or not. What do you think?
Well, you do have the choice. I mean, basically, this is removing the barrier of having to fill out the registration form. But before you're added to any public list, you're given 21 days to opt out if you don't want to be added. You can also cancel your registration at any time after that. So you have the choice whether or not you want to be on the registration list. And of course, you still have the choice to vote or not to vote.
Now, does automatic voter registration at the time of applying for a driver's license catch particularly young voters? I mean, those people who just become eligible to vote because of their age. And I'm guessing that's a demographic where voter registration is already very low compared to other age groups?
Yes, it is generally lower among younger groups, in part because they move so much. And if it's designed well, a registration process at the DMV can do a really good job of catching those voters. And there's two reasons that Oregon's policy has a good chance of doing that. Number one is it will allow people to pre-register when they're 16, which is when people often get their driver's licenses for the first time. So if you have a record at the DMV when you're 16, you'll be put on a pre-registration list, and then when you're eligible, when you turn 18, you'll automatically be registered to vote. Another reason it'll help, which is a reason that it helps everyone, is that when you change your driver's license record, for example, if you move for college or if you move for work, your registration address will automatically be updated too. So it'll help capture people when they first get their driver's licenses, and then it'll also help them keep their records up to date.
Now, how does this motor voter law compare to same-day voter registration? There's only a few states right now where voters can register on the same day they vote. I understand there was at least one state where that was overturned recently by Republicans, but it seems to be a no-brainer that you would have to remember to register several days before an election, and that offering people the chance to do it on the same day as voting simply removes that extra barrier. Is that, are there states that are sort of trying to do that, or the same-day registration, or is that sort of, not a very popular, because of what Republicans are doing, not a very popular approach?
Well, same-day registration does help. Studies have shown that it boosts turnout from 5 to 7% in states that have it. In the most recent election in 2014, there were states that had an even higher margin of turnout with same-day registration. There have been some states that have moved to it. Illinois just last year passed a law to have same-day registration. So that's a great way to help people who may miss the registration deadline, or who may not be registered at their current address and can use that same-day registration model to keep their information current.
Now, Jonathan, in many municipalities around the country, there are local elections happening this month, and voter turnout is dismally low at those. For example, in Los Angeles, in the earlier part of the month, 9% of those who are registered to vote, not eligible, but those who are registered to vote, 9% came to cast their ballots. Registering people to vote doesn't necessarily mean that there will be higher turnout, does it?
Well, making registration easier and making registration updates when people move easier does help with participation. There's lots of people, millions of people every year at major elections who want to vote but get stopped because of registration rules. But of course, if turnout is 9%, there is more going on there than just registration. And I think we need to look at a lot of things. One key thing, I think, for off-year elections and for municipal elections is making sure that people have the information they need about when elections are happening and how they can vote. Often when the media is not covering elections as much, people don't even know there's an election, or if they do, they don't know where they're supposed to vote. So that's one other way that we could help boost turnout in more types of elections.
Let's turn to what President Obama said about mandatory voting. He said this at a speech in Cleveland this week.
In Australia and some other countries, there's mandatory voting. It would be transformative if everybody voted. That would counteract money more than anything. If everybody voted, then it would completely change the political map in this country. Because the people who tend not to vote are young, they're lower income, they're skewed more heavily towards immigrant groups and minority groups.
Jonathan Braten, were you surprised by what Obama said? I mean, it sort of seemed to come out of nowhere.
Well, we haven't studied mandatory voting and how it would work in the United States. We don't have a position necessarily on mandatory voting. I think one thing that we do need to keep in mind, though, is there are lots of people who want to vote. I mean, when we see much larger turnout in 2008, much larger turnout in 2012, there are millions of Americans who do want to participate and do want to make their voices heard. And I think the president's point about making sure that people who may not always have the easiest time voting are able to have that opportunity is important. And I think that we should be looking at things like registration rules that block otherwise eligible people from participating. And Oregon's law, new law, which will help add hundreds of thousands of people to the rolls, is one way of making sure that people who want to vote are able to do so.
I just think of how jury selection happens when you receive that letter in the mail. You're obligated to respond somehow, either show up to serve on the jury or to be picked for a jury or give a really good excuse. And, it would be interesting to look at voting in that way as well as a civic obligation. How does the U.S. compare overall with other countries? President Obama mentioned Australia, but there are countries that hold elections on the weekends or make election day a national holiday, which we don't do. Are there other models that we could emulate? I'm sure there's so many models that ensure better turnout and stronger democracies everywhere in the world that we choose not to adopt here in the U.S.
Well, if you look at other democracies, the United States is on the lower end when it comes to registration rates and when it comes to turnout rates. One of the reasons for that is what we've already been discussing, which is that our registration rules are unnecessary barriers. There are about 50 million people nationwide who are eligible to vote, except that they're not registered. So that's one thing that we definitely need to look at nationwide, not just in Oregon. The Tuesday issue, I mean, we have Election Day on a Tuesday. It's not a holiday. For a lot of people, getting to the polls when they may have work or family obligations is a barrier. And one thing we've seen is states are looking at more early voting options, either opportunities to vote in person, the week or two before Election Day. There was actually the president convened a bipartisan commission to look at voting issues, and one of the things they recommended was having more options to vote before Election Day. So early voting can help people, especially if you have at least 2 weeks, if you have weekend hours and non-business hours, and if you have it at convenient locations.
And of course, Jonathan, the broader backdrop to the issue of voting that has received more coverage and tends to receive more coverage in the days leading up to a major presidential or congressional election is how the rights of people who actually want to vote are being taken away through these large number of states that have adopted voter ID laws, which the Supreme Court signed off on. The Historic Voting Rights Act has its main requirement for states gutted by the Supreme Court. Are these other fronts in the same battle more also about focusing on voter participation? I mean, it seems as though even those people who might be registered, might want to vote, will be finding it harder and harder to vote because of mostly Republican desires to see low turnout, since it just happens to benefit them to have lower turnout.
Well, just last week was the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March.
Yeah.
That was the march that Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders led, and was one of the major drivers that led us to have the Voting Rights Act. And of course, the motion picture Selma covered that very vividly. The Voting Rights Act, as you said, was gutted by the Supreme Court in recent years. They took away the Section 5, the preclearance provision, which is what requires jurisdictions that have a particular history of discrimination to get pre-approval. And we've seen the effects of that since that decision. Texas has gone ahead with a very harsh voter ID law that had been blocked by the Voting Rights Act, but subsequently has been allowed to go into effect. Now, we and other groups are still trying to get it blocked in the courts, but it's been in effect, and it's stopped a lot of people from voting, and it's had particularly restrictive effects on African Americans and Latinos who don't have the types of ID that the law requires.
Well, Jonathan, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll post a link to the Brennan Center's website at uprisingwithsonali.com.
Thanks so much for having me.
My guest is Jonathan Braten. He's a counsel in the Brennan Center's Democracy Program. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. This week marks Sunshine Week, a period every year that focuses on transparency in government. And to mark this week, there is going to be an event for our Southern California audience on Sunday at the Santa Monica Bay Women's Club, featuring my guest Trevor Timm, whom we are trying to contact right now for an interview, and Daniel Ellsberg of the Pentagon Papers. He's, of course, the famous whistleblower from the Vietnam War era, and the two of them will be speaking at an event at the Santa Monica Bay Women's Club, and you can get tickets at kpfk.org. Again, this is for our Southern California listeners. I will be at that event as well. Well, it was highly ironic that President Obama, whose administration boasts of being the most transparent in history, chose this Monday to officially announce he would be exempt from Freedom of Information Act requests. The Office of the Administration, which provides broad administrative support for the White House, was originally shielded from FOIA requests by President George W. Bush, who made it an unofficial policy. After years of lobbying by activists who wanted Obama to overturn that policy, he instead made it permanent. Meanwhile, controversy still continues over Hillary Clinton's private email account. The person who could possibly be the next president was able to shield herself from FOIA requests of her communications during her time as Secretary of State. My guest is Trevor Timm, co-founder and executive director of Freedom of the Press Foundation, journalist, activist, and lawyer who writes a twice-weekly column for The Guardian on privacy, free speech, and national security. He's contributed to The Atlantic, Al Jazeera, Foreign Policy, Harvard Law and Policy Review, PBS Media Shift, and Political. Welcome to Uprising, Trevor. Trevor, we can't hear you, so we're going to have you on the phone while you... There you are. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
First, can you explain how it is even possible for a president to simply say they won't comply with FOIA? How was Bush able to do it, and how is Obama making the Office of Administration permanently exempt from FOIA requests?
Well, there's always been some controversy about communications between the president and his staff and about how that actually relates to FOIA. You know, the Freedom of Information Act was passed to essentially allow people to get records from executive agencies, but the controversy has always been over the White House. But there have been White House offices that have accepted FOIA requests for decades. So, for example, the National Security Council, which is the group of people that advise the president on national security issues, took FOIA requests for decades. And so did the Office of Administration, which actually is the archiver of all White House emails. And you know, the Bush administration decided quite suddenly when there was the, if you remember, the attorney firing scandal involving Karl Rove and the politicization of the U.S. Attorney's Office, they deleted millions of emails, and there was FOIA lawsuits to try to get them to reveal what they still had. And all of a sudden, the Bush administration said that actually this office isn't required to comply with FOIA, despite the fact that they've been doing it for decades. And they actually got a court to agree with them. But when the Obama administration came into office, you know, President Obama had promised the most transparent administration in history, and many people thought that he would, even though the court said that he couldn't or he didn't have to comply with FOIA, that he would still accept FOIA requests. And unfortunately, you know, they've gone the complete opposite direction and have deleted the FOIA regulations from their website and are saying that now there is no way that they would be accepting FOIA requests permanently for this office. So, you know, it's just another disappointment when it comes to the Obama administration and transparency.
Is the president or any of his spokespeople explaining why they're taking this position?
Well, they're essentially claiming that, well, a court told the previous administration that they didn't have to comply with FOIA with this office, and so they are just, you know, claiming to be carrying out the court's orders. But there is nothing preventing them from voluntarily doing this. You know, in fact, Electronic Frontier Foundation wrote several letters to the Obama administration when they first started, imploring them to, despite this court ruling, to continue to accept FOIA requests to the Office of Administration because it's so key to figuring out exactly what the White House is doing, and they refused.
And of course, some of the things that are kept secret are extremely important life and death issues. For example, the ACLU recently filed a lawsuit against the Obama administration requesting disclosure of the criteria for the so-called kill list for unmanned drone targets. And they want to know exactly who the U.S. is killing, how many have been killed, why they're, you know, why people fall on the kill list to begin with. There's been no public information about the criteria that's used to determine how the U.S. singles out these people for these extrajudicial assassinations. How exactly is the Obama administration the most transparent in history? I mean, I'm not really sure if anyone's actually done a study comparing them, but I don't quite see it.
Well, I mean, that's a great question. You know, I think a lot of people have been asking that ever since they started making that claim, you know, when they first came into office. You know, we have to remember the President Obama, or the candidate Obama, I should say, in 2008, you know, made a lot of great speeches when it came to government transparency, promising to protect whistleblowers. You know, his first day in office, he signed a directive telling the agencies that they were to have a presumption of openness when it came to FOIA requests and other transparency activities. But just on Friday, the AP, the Associated Press, came out with a study showing that the Obama administration has actually denied more FOIA requests and censored more documents when it comes to these requests than anyone in history.
Wow.
And they actually broke their record in 2014, which they had set the previous year in 2013. When you look at the actual numbers versus what they say, it looks like they are as secretive or more secretive than the Bush administration. And like I said, that is, especially disconcerting considering the promises that were made when they came into office.
But hey, at least we can watch every single Obama speech on whitehouse.gov and read transcripts instantly and have access to streaming video. I mean, they're pretty savvy when it comes to online communication with the public and having access to information that's already public be easily available. But of course, the real question is how can people access information that is not publicly available? Let's turn to the Clinton email scandal. I mean, some have said, oh, it's no big deal. So what if she used her personal account for official business as Secretary of State? And this is just a manufactured controversy by Republicans who don't want to see her be president. Why is it important?
Well, I think it's important for a few reasons. First, this is another instance where it's a government official trying to thwart the Freedom of Information Act. These agents, there are directives in the State Department and executive branch wide that talk about archiving emails and making sure that they are available when the public or reporters request them.
But do we know that she was trying to thwart information?
We don't know for a fact that that was her intention, but whether or not it was, that was the result. The New York Times had a huge article explaining how there had been dozens and dozens of FOIA requests to the State Department where the State Department just rejected them outright. They didn't say why. They said these records weren't available. And this had been happening for years before we actually found out about this email account. Even if she had a reason to use private email, she could have at least alerted the State Department and the State Department FOIA offices so that they could begin to archive the emails when they were happening. But, there are other issues at play here as well. The security of her emails, for example. If you ask any systems administrator, operating your own email server is incredibly difficult, and it's especially hard to secure. And the Secretary of State is one of the biggest targets for foreign spying that there is. There are dozens of foreign intelligence agencies that I'm sure would love to get their hands on these emails. And, at the same time, the government is preaching about the dangers of cybersecurity and the fact that the U.S. is far behind. Having their Secretary of State on a private email server really opens them up to security problems.
And so just to clarify, Trevor, I mean, maybe people don't quite understand this. Most people have, Gmail accounts or Yahoo accounts, et cetera, and those are commercially available free email accounts. It's not that the Secretary of State Clinton was using those kinds of servers. She literally had a private server in her home, which was archiving and was essentially hosting the email communication. How did nobody notice this in the State Department? If she's communicating with people and they're seeing the origin of her email address, nobody noticed for years that she was using her own email address?
Well, that's actually one of the most bizarre parts of this, that actually hundreds or at least 100 people, maybe more, knew that she was using this email address. Actually, a few reporters even knew. Gawker, for example, had posed questions to the White House in 2012 or 2013 asking why Clinton was using a private email server, and yet there was no response. Nobody raised any alarms. Nobody told Clinton this may be wrong, and just let her continue doing it. And we've seen what the results of this are. She claims that she was using this email for both private and public reasons. And so she actually ended up deleting half of the emails, 30,000 of them, off of the server.
I mean, I even don't do this. I have my own personal account and I have my work account, and I try not to mix the two. You know, you just do that as somebody who has a public life and a private life. I mean, but this is the Secretary of State using the same account. And of course, in using this private account, her emails aren't automatically archived for documentation like emails of other officials in the U.S. government are. So you can't go back and say, what was the communication between the Secretary of State and some other person on such and such a date. You can't do that because she has the archive, and now she's saying she just deleted a bunch of them. Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I should point out that this isn't just a problem with Hillary Clinton. I mean, this is a particularly egregious example, given that she was actually running her own private email server, and she was doing this exclusively on her own. But there have been many government scandals where government officials are using their private email accounts to get around public records requests or keep what they're doing hidden from the public, and it's actually become a very big problem. We just found out after Hillary Clinton admitted to it that Chuck Hagel, the former Secretary of Defense, was also using a private email account. During the Bush administration, the attorney firing scandal that I mentioned, there was countless White House officials using private email accounts to get around these record requests and to hide their communications from the public. And, it's a real problem. And despite the fact that there are agency regulations now, tougher regulations that mandate that employees do this, it still happens. And so I think that's why Congress should really capitalize on this scandal and pass FOIA reform with some actual teeth.
So let's talk about that. And actually, even before we get to that, how important a tool has the Freedom of Information Act been for journalists, for members of the public to determine what is happening inside the government? I don't think people appreciate this enough unless they're those like you who are actually engaged in using it to try to get information.
No, the Freedom of Information Act, the importance of it can't be overstated. It passed during the Lyndon Johnson administration, and for 40 or 50 years has been a vital tool for public accountability. Reporters all over the country and actually increasingly nonprofit organizations and advocacy organizations file hundreds or actually tens of thousands of FOIA requests per year, and it often leads to the government being held more accountable where they wouldn't beforehand. That said, the FOIA process right now is incredibly broken, despite the fact that reporters do get information quite regularly that is newsworthy. Oftentimes they have to wait years and years to get a response, and when they do get a response, often the documents that they receive are almost 100% blacked out. And the fact that the government has so many exceptions that they can claim that it, essentially allows them to avoid accountability, even though there is this law. And so, I think that's why we really need to see some reform in this area, because the government has these exceptions, which essentially they can say, we just don't want to release that. We don't have an actual reason that will hurt us if we do, besides embarrassment, but we're just going to keep that from the public.
And so tell us about the effort to strengthen the Freedom of Information Act and thereby strengthen transparency. There was an act that almost passed last December. What is it? Can it properly strengthen and protect FOIA, or is there a chance for it to be reintroduced?
Yeah, so there was a bill in the late 2014 in the last congressional session. It was called the FOIA Improvements Act, and it was actually a very modest, uncontroversial bill. It didn't, I would have liked to see it go much, much farther in mandating the government, for example, retain their emails, and that they actually get rid of some of these FOIA exceptions. But essentially, it was, it still was quite good. It would have modernized the FOIA system. It would have allowed judges to make decisions about whether something was in the public interest or not, which a lot of people don't realize that that is a lot of times not an option for judges. And it was actually passed in both houses unanimously. There was not a single vote against it. Wow. The House and Senate actually had slightly different bills. So the House had to vote on it one more time to make it law and send it to President Obama's desk. But on the last day of Congress, before the session ended, John Boehner, the Republican leader in the House, decided not to bring it to the floor. And so the bill essentially died, despite the fact that not a single congressman had voted against it. And we found out later that the reason was that a lot of the agencies involved in the executive branch had secretly been lobbying him and other Congress members not to bring it to the floor. And this was despite the fact that, like I said, it was incredibly modest. It was actually based on the Justice Department's FOIA policy, their internal policy, almost word for word. So essentially, these agencies wouldn't have had to do anything differently than they were actually already supposed to be doing, yet they were still lobbying against the bill.
Well, Trevor, finally, in the last few minutes of our conversation, the issue of transparency in government goes hand in hand with the issue of press freedom. And you are the executive director of the Freedom of the Press Foundation. And in addition to possibly being the least transparent administration in U.S. history, President Obama's government has also been one of the most aggressive in going after journalists who use other means to determine what the government is doing and hold the government accountable for ordinary people. And so, are you sort of disappointed that President Obama's administration, coming after the Bush administration, has, only made it harder for the public to understand the role of government in general? I mean, we've covered this so much on our program with the trials of whistleblowers and the persecution of journalists, etc. But general comments on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of the great tragedies of the Obama administration. I think a lot of people have been disappointed with some of the promises they've made that they've come up short on. But transparency is actually the one issue where they have done a complete 180, where they actually promised something and then did the complete opposite once they got into office. You briefly mentioned it, but the protection of whistleblowers has been particularly egregious. The candidate Obama talked about protecting whistleblowers who expose waste, fraud, and abuse. And yet, during the 6 years of the Obama administration, they've prosecuted more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act than all other administrations combined, which is an incredible stat when you think about it. And this has in turn led to a real chilling of journalism. If you ask any national security reporter, for example, they will tell you that the climate for receiving information from government sources has never been worse in a generation. And this is because government officials are now terrified to talk to reporters about anything, whether it's classified or not. The government has these really draconian, what they call insider threat programs, where they are essentially, giving government officials lie detector tests every 3 or 4 months, spying on every communication that they make in an attempt to root out sources for journalists, which they equate with spies. Right. And, that's just not how this country has worked for decades or even centuries. And it's a real shame that a president who promised this has ended up in this situation.
Trevor, I want to thank you very much for joining us today, and I'll see you and hopefully others in our Southern California audience this Sunday in Santa Monica. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.
Trevor Timm is co-founder and executive director of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, journalist, activist, and lawyer who writes a twice-weekly column for The Guardian. He, alongside Daniel Ellsberg and myself, will be at the Santa Monica Bay Women's Club this Sunday at 11 a.m. That's at 1210 4th Street. This is, of course, for our Southern California audience. You can get tickets to the event at kpfk.org. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shum is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Alexander Holmes is our technical director. Teddy Robinson and Kiana Turner are our audio engineers. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. Have a wonderful weekend. I'll see you Monday.